evening, everybody. Without further ado, let's introduce the director, Steve Kapadia. And Amy Winehouse's friend and former manager, Nick Shamat. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Congratulations on a great film that's winning awards and getting a lot of nominations this season. Let's just start from the beginning and tell us really what brought you to this project and the making of it.
The project started really kind of off the back of my previous film, a film called Senna, a documentary. Hey, which I kind of was the first film where I suppose I kind of experimented with this technique. It was my first documentary, and this idea of just trying to make a film using archive to feel as cinematic as possible and not having talking heads, and just trying to get under the skin and seeing the world from the point of view of the main story, the main character. And the film did quite well in the UK. I live in London, I'm based in London. And there was somebody at Universal Music who had seen that film and liked it a lot, and contacted my producer, James Gay Reese, the producer of Senna, and said, would you be interested in making a film like Senna about Amy? And we'd had lots of offers post Senna to do other sports films. So people saying literally, would you make a film about me? And I didn't really bite, I didn't want to do that, I didn't want to repeat myself, but there was something about Amy's story that kind of intrigued me. I'm a North Londoner, and I lived down a road quite close to where she lived and grew up. I didn't know her, I never met her, I never saw her perform live or anything, but there was just a lot of questions, I suppose, in my head about why her life turned out the way it did. I remember just feeling a bit uncomfortable with the images I was seeing and the fact that she was on stage in that state. I just remember thinking, something's not right here, I don't get it. And so my way into the story really was just to see if I could answer the questions that I had in the back of my mind, saying that something doesn't seem right. I want to know why did it go that way? That was it really, it was just a gut feeling.
So you hadn't necessarily mapped it out before you made this, no? You discovered it as you went through it?
Yeah, because at that point I didn't know anyone in the story, I'm not in the music business, I've never done a music video or anything like that, so there never is a map. Actually, what was interesting about this film, it's actually, it was a conscious decision to make a film with no map. There was no screenplay, there was no document. It's the only film that I've made where there was never a structure or a piece of paper or a treatment where we went and said, this is the film we're going to make. It was literally, somebody asked me, would you be interested in making a film? And I said, yeah, if you can get all the music, all the publishing rights, get all of that, and then just leave us alone, we'll come back with a film. And that's kind of how it worked really. We were able to get music and the publishing for her songs, and then I said, you need to really leave us alone and let me speak to everyone I want to speak to, and we'll come back with a movie in a couple of years, and that's essentially what happened. 3 years it took.
It took 3 years?
Yeah.
Wow. Tell us a bit about how you two met, because that's an interesting story, how Nick came onto it.
So I didn't know of Nick at the beginning of the process. So literally we just said, I'd meet people and say, okay, who should I talk to? And quite a few people early on said, oh, you should talk to Nick. Nick was very close to Amy, and he was there right from the beginning. And so I can't remember if I think I called you up or something.
Yeah.
Maybe you should take it from it. I called up Nick, and what became apparent quite early on was that most people didn't want to have any part to do with this movie, because it was a very painful experience to be around that world. There wasn't much trust of the media, of journalists, of filmmakers, or anyone like that. And so I contacted Nick, and then maybe Nick can take over on his initial reaction to me saying, I'd like to talk to him about a film.
I didn't want anything to do with the film at the beginning. Thought it was too soon. The one sort of thing going through my mind when I got the call from PSIFF is, this is annoying because Senna was amazing, and I don't want to really like what this guy's about, because I didn't want to, I just wasn't in that headspace. But I thought Senna was such an amazing film, because whether you were a big fan of him as a racing car driver or a celebrity was irrelevant. What he seemed to do so well was get to the soul of the person. And you know, I'd seen the film a few years before when Amy was in a terrible place, and I saw it with my fiance, who's now my wife, and I said, we had a long conversation about Senna after the film, and my wife reminded me at the time, I said, wouldn't it be amazing if someone was able to get to the core of Amy and show the world that how brilliant she is, because at that point she was so misinterpreted by the media. So to cut a long story short, it started off with me really not being into the idea, and I guess just over quite a long period of time with big gaps, PSIFF would call again, and I said, look, I'm not going to be involved, but maybe I can help you with names and people. And then I just found a trust started to come about, and again, my wife reminded me a story of how at first I'd come home and say, oh, you know that film Senna, the director's doing a film on Amy, but I want nothing to do with it, I'm not even going to talk to him. And then like a couple of weeks later, yeah, I'm meeting up with that guy again, but just out of respect. And then on the third time, she was like, where are you going with all your tapes? And I was like, I'm giving them to that guy, Asif. She was like, what, everything? I was like, yeah, I'm giving him everything. He's the man. And that was it really. I kind of, once I trusted Asif, I said, look, make this film. I don't believe you'll be able to make this film. I think there'll be a lot of obstacles in the way. And for me, it's just really important that we see something that's really true to who Amy was, and something that doesn't skirt around the darkness of what happened. And I was very sceptical, and then years later I saw the cut and I was so moved, because I thought, wow, he's done everything he said he'll do, which is he's spent time, gone into it, and the biggest voice in the film through the happy times and the sad times is Amy, and that's the most important factor for me, you know.
It's one interesting thing is because when I did first contact Nick, it was, and it seems crazy now, but it was only a year after Amy had died. So I thought it was too soon to make the film. I was kind of sceptical, thinking, well, everyone knows everything. Why would anyone want to see a film about Amy when we know everything? But it came out of conversations I was having with Nick. Nick was also the person who said, I know of Julia and Lauren, her friends. Nick was the person who said, you should really meet these girls. They're just like Amy, they're difficult, they're going to be a challenge to pin down, but they know the real girl. And at this point, there was no conversations about footage or archive. All I wanted to do was just get in a room to talk to them, because I couldn't even get that stage of just meeting face to face. And because of really the conversation with Nick, that the kind of format of making the film came out of saying, well, let's meet somewhere, but because I can tell you're quite uncomfortable talking, we can't meet in a cafe somewhere public. Let's meet somewhere safe and private. I won't bring a crew, there'll be no camera, we'll just talk, but I don't want to sit here taking notes. So I'm going to record the conversation, audio, just audio, so that I can pay attention to what you're saying, but I cannot use it, I will not use it, unless you sign a release form. And this is the form. If you're not happy with anything you say, if you don't want to talk about something, don't talk about it, but that's the only way, you know, I understand why you think this story has to be done a particular way. And so I just started doing a series of audio interviews, and each person, it felt like by the end of the conversation, a lot had come off their kind of shoulders and off their chest, and it became very much like therapy. There were a lot of tears, it was quite emotional. And it might start off like with us talking for half an hour, and we'd be there 5 hours later still talking.
What was really interesting for me was that at the beginning I really felt like Asif wanted to know but didn't know anything really. And then towards the sort of latter part of making the film, I think people really close to me would almost, like I was getting information, like I was saying, what do you think happened there, and why are people saying this, and I feel like you almost became like a PhD student of Amy, like you knew everything, you knew everyone, and that all of a sudden it became clear that there was someone that understood that I could go and talk to, and became really cathartic.
It's quite interesting. Her life, I think there were lots of compartments in Amy's life, lots of people in different places, and it was strange because a lot of these people didn't get along, or there was a lot of distrust or blame or anger with different groups. But every person in each of these different groups felt the same way for her. They did genuinely all care about her, but they didn't trust anyone else, and everyone thought they were her best friend. It was just interesting in a way to understand a bit of Amy, how she managed to have all of these people that all felt they were so close to her, but none of them ever met, or spoke to each other, or liked each other, and somehow it must have been quite exhausting for her to keep all of these, juggle these relations, all these plates spinning. And then for me to kind of trap into, Nick, Juliette, Lauren were there for the early period, but then they were not there for the middle period or the latter period, and then I meet someone else and I talk to Nick and say, actually, I know you don't like that person, or you're not sure you like that person, but actually when I talk to them, they're saying exactly the same things that you were saying. But no one was ever quite in control, and she wasn't quite in control. It's really complicated. She's a very complicated girl, and the whole situation was it was really tough, it was really crazy. And just everyone was carrying so much baggage and became quite ill, it seemed, from being around Amy. Like, some of them literally became addicts. And they're all quite young still. And other people were just emotionally, their lives had been, in a way, messed up by being a part of it and then not having any kind of closure because of how things panned out and the way she died. And they all thought, if it carries on like this, she's going to die. So it was really a very difficult kind of universe to step into and then take home to your own life, because you can't just put it away. You start dreaming about it, you start thinking about it. Every dinner party conversation, you're dreading anyone saying, "What are you doing? What are you working on now?" Then ask, what are you doing? And then anyone, "Hey, right, I don't like her," or something would come up and I'd start defending her or something. My wife would be like, "Oh God, you've done it again." The whole conversation becomes about Amy. And it was like that Senna a few years previously, where it just would take over. It takes over your life, I suppose.
Nick, you refer to Asif as like the PhD, if you will, student of Amy. Obviously, you've known her very closely as a dear friend. Did the film or the process deepen your understanding of her in some way?
Yeah, it did, because I just had my very personal views and experiences, which is kind of all I could have. And when you see something as tragic as, time goes by really quick, and we had 7 years of working together at a really amazing stage in both our lives. I met her when she was 16, I was 19. We travelled, we went through lots of experiences together, and it was an amazing time, a really happy time. And a time where we were both striving to do something. We didn't really know what we were doing a lot of the time. And then there was like a 5-year decline, and where she became one of the biggest stars in the world, and she became massively famous, but everything was falling to bits around her. And I could see it all happening, and I could see, I had a terrible fear of where it was going, and unfortunately I was right to have that fear. And then all of a sudden she passed away, and then you're left with the grief and going back to the past and kind of going, but the past still feels like it's just been. And I guess what I'm trying to say is so much happened in a short period of time that I was so close that we'd been through so much, I assumed I knew it all. So I was processing with all the information that I had and my own experiences. And then through spending time with Asif and having someone like Asif who was neutral and not around and didn't have an agenda or any personal issues with anyone, I found it was really helping me to learn things. Also, I grew up, all of a sudden I'm a grown up, I'm a dad, I'm married, I've been through, I'm not a kid anymore. And I think there's lots I learned about Amy as a person. There's lots I reflected on the past that I didn't see at that stage in my life. And then I had someone I could call and say, I've always thought this, what do you think about that? Or vice versa, Asif would say, who's this person? And so I learned lots about her relationships. I didn't know she was on medication when she was in her teens. I learned a lot about her and stuff that I think's helped me come to terms with how things went, you know?
When you, so you were 19 when you met her, thereabouts?
She was 19. Yeah.
What, tell me about the first time you heard her sing. When did you listen to her voice and think, wow, this is really something extraordinary?
Well, I was managing a young artist called Tyler James, and we would, you know, he was raving about his friend that wasn't recording, wasn't making music, wasn't applying herself, and he was like, I think you might get on with her. You should call her and see if you can manage to get some music off her. So I got her number, and I thought that I could just give it big time record executive, even though I was 19 and making tin, and she wasn't having any of it at all. She like flicked me off to the side, and then I thought, okay, I'm going to try being the funny guy and see if that works, and it kind of worked a lot better than the wannabe record executive. And then I realised that I'd been pursuing her on the phone but hadn't heard anything, and she was saying, well, you know, I don't know if I want to send you my music, and I don't want to record. She told me she didn't write. She told me that she just likes jazz standards. And then, completely out of the blue, like weeks later, I got a jiffy bag, you know, in the post, covered in like a million stickers and Amy scribbles. And I thought, and it was a real notice me package. It was like you couldn't miss it. And I remember putting it was a cassette tape, and I put it on in my car, and I literally had to pull over. I was blown away. I thought, has she just recorded has she sort of taken an old record? She got an old live recording of some amazing artist and just sent it to me for a laugh. And then I called her and I chased her, and then the first time I ever saw her sing was with a big band. The first time I saw her sing live, and she was with a bunch of, like, a huge big band that used to get together in North London, and invited her to come and sing with them, and it was literally this young 16-year-old girl stood in the middle of like a bunch of 60, 70-year-old musicians, and she was by far the biggest instrument on the stage, and just mind-blowing. And I just, at that point, I thought, oh my God, I can't believe it, I found someone amazing. I have to do everything I can to help her have a career. And then every moment was a challenge from that moment on. But amazing challenge. And literally I had to, our whole chemistry was based on how do I get her to focus on stuff, get her around great musicians, get her around great studios, make sure she's always having fun, and then it maybe something will happen. And so that was our chemistry. It was never about how do we get money, how do we get noticed, how do we get into a meeting. It was always how do we have a good time, how do we record something great. And I think you see a bit of that, you know, it's nice for me to see those early days edited the way it is, because there was such a great energy, and it was such a fun time going through that process, you know.
I mean, you had so much that you recorded, you know, you videoed. I mean, that must have been like that was a treasure trove for you. You couldn't have known about this coming?
No, that's the whole thing. I have, you know, when you have the finished film, there's always kind of this feeling maybe the audience might have, oh, you just found my archive, and therefore, you know, you just have to cut it together. But actually, you don't know it exists when you start a film. You know, I didn't know Nick existed, so he then just happened to, after we met, I did this thing on this film where, just to try to explain what we were doing, because most of the people were not in the film business, I would say just come over and meet the crew, meet the editor, meet the producer, So I invited Nick actually quite early on, after we'd spoken, to come to our edit suite. and just have a look around and just think, we're kind of a small production, we're not a big studio or anything like that. This is it. If you've got any questions, this is, you know, who's making the movie, this is the team of researchers. And I think Nick noticed on the wall, like a timeline we'd stuck up of just what happened each year. And I didn't know it at the time, but I think that made a kind of point to him that actually someone's spending a bit of time on putting this detail together of what happened in Amy's life and when. And at some point during that conversation, I think Nick just opened his laptop and showed me a few little QuickTime clips that he had brought in. And then that was a big moment, because I thought, okay, I've never seen that footage, I've never seen Amy, I've never seen that kind of access to someone that becomes so famous. And the first few things I suppose that stood out is how funny she is, and how witty, and that kind of very London-y, for me, very London-y kind of humour. And then you can just see, wow, that's just like 2 years before this other footage I've seen where she's not in a good way. So in such a short space of time, she's gone from there to there. And then you think, okay, instinctively, okay, I can see there's a movie for me. There's something I can show, and it's the intimacy of kind of hanging out with her that you get through Nick's footage. And the other thing that I thought about later that came out of it was just this kind of, you know, all the rules of drama. One of the first rules is don't look in the camera. And what's really interesting about a lot of this footage, she's always looking in the camera. She's always looking straight at the person who's filming it, and therefore the audience, us, and talking directly to us, you know. So at one point it might be Juliet or Lauren filming, like Happy Birthdays, she sings straight to us, to the audience, and we're her best friend. We become Lauren, we become Nick at one point, we then become, you know, she sings on stage and looks at us and smiles at us, and later on we're her boyfriend, and later on we become a TV company, and then the next minute we're the paparazzi. And it was just, there's something about Amy's kind of relationship to the lens that I found quite interesting in this footage. The fact that she, you know, she's running away and literally punching the camera at one point when a paparazzi are handing her outside her house. That I remember thinking there's something really strong in that material, on her talking, holding the camera herself and talking to us and singing to us, and it just is effortless. You know, she just does it. She's just so comfortable with herself, and then where it goes and how dark it becomes later on. You know, some of the most shocking footage for me are those sort of selfies she took when she was in a bad way, the black and white shots. So that's something that just quite instinctively in the first footage I saw from Nick, the fact that she was looking straight at me, I remember feeling there's something weird going on here. I'm not quite sure how we're going to use it, but I find that really powerful.
Were there any other significant breakthroughs in the making of the movie in terms of access to somebody or discovering some kind of documentation, video, audio?
I mean, I suppose the thing for me, this is one of the reasons why it's always interesting when I'm not going in there as a hardcore fan, is just, there were a couple of things actually. Talking to Nick during one of his interviews, and he started telling me a story about the moment when he thought things were going bad and Amy needs help, and, you know, why don't we go and talk to a doctor? And he told me this story, and there was literally a light bulb moment. We go, whoa. So you mean you're the guy that took Amy to rehab? And he was like, yeah. And so what that song's about, you're the guy. And, you know, just realising that there's an actual real incident that took place, which Amy then took and turned it into a song that we all know, and, you know, danced to. But it's quite literally a page from a diary of an incident that happened, and that started happening time and time again. And sometimes we already had the lyrics, so it's like you've got this map. I didn't realise how literally that map slotted into her life. And so Nick and other people would tell me stories, and then it was just a question of, okay, well, that's that song, that's that song, that's that song. And then it was really looking at the lyrics, I suppose, and kind of realising these lyrics are so personal, and finding diaries that people had or letters they had, and seeing how she created the songs. And I remember thinking that everyone talked about her voice, but for me the writing is really incredible. And it's all her, you know, and at such a young age, and a very unique voice, and very London-y, the humour and the wit and the intelligence is all in there, and the handwriting. So I remember feeling that was a kind of a moment of, I wanted to use this text, which is, you know, normally it's not my cinematic idea of reading someone's handwriting, but there was something about Amy's handwriting that I felt was actually really powerful, and how she worked out the lyrics and the songs, and what rhymed and what didn't rhyme. And that was, I suppose, a big moment, realising I wanted to highlight this. It became a story about an artist. Where does art come from? And in her case, it was real life, real incidents that she turned something bad into something good by creating these records. And then she performed them, and every time she performed them depending on how she felt that moment. Like a jazz artist, it was never the same thing twice. but which is a problem when you become a pop star. You know, just sing a bloody record. We don't care what you actually feel like this moment in time. They want to dance. In fact, just mime. You know, we don't care. We'll play the record. You know, that obviously didn't sit comfortably with her and who she was. So it was interesting just seeing that kind of journey of her as an artist and how that affected what we knew of her, you know, who she became later on in life. So I think the lyrics and the real stories, the real incidents that were all in her songs was a big kind of revelation and a big part of the film, I think.
That brings to mind that extraordinary scene with Tony Bennett when she's doubting herself, but that is part of her greatness, and he sees that, of course. You managed to avoid in the movie being judgmental of people. There's lots of different characters in the movie, of course. Was that a hard thing to do, or is that just the way that the filmmaking process flowed?
I mean, it really, you know, does turn quite dark and quite heavy, and I heard a lot of not great stories, and saw some quite, you know, dark footage, and there's a lot more funny stuff, there's also a lot more dark stuff, and it just felt like the way to do it was always going to be a challenge to find the right balance of what do you put in, what do you not put in. You know, a lot of her friends would say to me, you know, why, Juliet and Lauren, for example, were like, you know, why do you have to ask about that? Can't you just show the healthy Amy? Can't you just show the good times? And, you know, there was a version of the film where it's nearly like an hour and a half long, and it's just up to before she recorded Back to Black, you know. But it was important. It felt like we had to go into the latter part of her life and explain that. So the challenge really, we have a brilliant editor, Chris King, and the producer and I work very closely together, James K. Reese, the producer, trying to find that balance of what goes in, what doesn't go in, and hopefully not repeating yourself too much. How does each song get used in the story? At which point do you have that particular live performance? But trying to get the essence. All you can do with a movie is get the essence of a person's life, and who are the key players around her who made decisions, some good, some not so good, some obviously in their own interest, and she was the one who got the worst out of it. I felt we had to try and give the audience enough, but the aim wasn't to try to point a direct finger at anyone, but just to show there were a lot of people around as an entourage who obviously were making choices for her, which, you know, which is why that initial question I had, that's why she's on stage in such a bad state, because other people are saying maybe it's handy if you do one more show, one more gig, this will be good for your career, all of that.
Nick, I can only imagine how difficult it was for you personally to go relive all of this. How did you keep going? What did you tell yourself to stay focused on this project?
I'm really fortunate because it was a horrendous thing to witness, and I would have done anything, and I tried everything I could to intervene, to get her on track, but ultimately I was living my life. You know, I was getting on with it, and, you know, I'd hear from Amy, and if ever there was anything I could do, I'd do it in a heartbeat. But it was very frustrating, the lack of questioning from people, and how it felt, you know, when she finally died, it was a shock. It was a horrible shock, it was a horrible time. It happened on my wedding weekend, which was a nightmare, and she was due at the wedding. But I couldn't believe how it actually got to that. It actually got to the point where Amy died. And it wasn't, you know, you sometimes hear in music, entertainment, someone goes on a mad night out or has a binge, but when it's a 5-year decline, it's a very long time, and there's absolutely no reason for it to have happened over that long period of time. And I think so. There was just so much stuff to process, and but I feel like there were people around her that weren't living their life, they weren't moving on, and thank God, you know, I always sort of got on with it, and, you know, I felt so sorry for Amy, and that was the part that I needed to deal with. Because I know that she was 27 when she died. She didn't want to die. She wasn't someone that she appreciated life. She loved music. She wanted a family. She wanted all the good things that you can have in life, and she didn't get them. So for me, when I saw the film, when I finally saw the film, I thought, brilliant. There's now an official document. Someone's not being judgmental, someone's not made it about them. because everything that was coming out about Amy seemed to be about whoever was saying whatever they were saying. I thought this film's not about anyone other than Amy, really, and there's not, you know, you're absolutely right to say it's non-judgmental, because it isn't. It's, although there's people are recalling memories and situations, you're seeing real footage, real moments that happened at the time. But it's not a bunch of people go, you know, you could quite easily get a lot of big characters around Amy together around a table. We'd all be killing each other in minutes. And the film isn't about that, thank God. And hopefully you come away going, what a tragedy, what a shame, but what a brilliant artist. And it would be amazing if going into the future, the media, various people, the way they consume news, people that are around artists, managers, record labels, whoever, hopefully people will give a bit of thought if there's a very long and public decline that happens, you know, in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to throw it open to the audience in a minute for any of your questions, but just one thing quickly, more if I may. Do you think, to both of you, was Amy aware of her own greatness, or did she just get on with it and do what she felt compelled to do to make music?
I think she was aware of it, embarrassed by it, or not at ease with it. But I think she knew that she was special and didn't know what to do with that information, if that makes sense.
I had a conversation with Juliet about something like that, where quite early on, you know, there'd just been a restaurant somewhere eating some food, and someone would walk up saying, I heard you sing the other day, you know, I loved it. And Amy she wasn't very good at taking some positivity on, because of whatever was in the way she was built and the lack of sort of self-esteem. So instead of saying, thank you, that's great, she'd somehow say something rude. And I remember Juliet sort of saying, why do you have to say that? But she'd actually like almost attack the person, giving them a compliment. She couldn't accept a compliment very well. I heard that from a few people. She just couldn't deal with it. I think she knew, but she didn't like other people knowing or saying it to her, which is the sadness of it. And that's really early on, that's way before Back to Black I'm talking about. And that, you know, that's something built inside of her that just can't take it good. Maybe she didn't get a lot of it earlier on. I don't know.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, questions? Gentleman at the front.
Nick, I want to offer my condolences on your loss of your good friend, and asked if I was wondering, without pointing fingers or naming names, if you've gained any insight on how the people around an addict or an alcoholic can enable their behavior, and if you've had any insights or thoughts about that.
Did everybody hear the question? Yeah. Okay.
It's a big question, isn't it? I mean, it's really hard, but I think from talking to all of these people, it just felt like a lot of, literally her writing, her singing, a lot of it, I think was a cry for help. And kind of, it's all about love in a way, in the end. If you could sum up the whole film, it's just about her wanting to be loved and wanting love, and the songs are all about kind of broken relationships, or her heart being broken. And fortunately, the love always seemed to come with something else attached, you know. It was always somehow linked to career. And I think people around her, what happened was the latter period, a lot of people have got a bit confused about what they were doing and how they were trying to help her. It's really hard, because she's a very complex girl. I heard lots of stories like the one I was just saying about when someone did try to help her, including people like Nick, she'd push them away. You know, and then people just said there's only so much battering they could take, where they're trying to offer help and she's pushing them away, and other people are obviously in it for themselves, are being drawn in closer and closer. And that's what it was like. I think it was a challenge to be around her for a long period of time. And, she made choices, but lots of people made choices, and it's like a perfect storm. This is the thing. Her life, her fact that she had that song coming out at that moment in time, which became a hit, Rehab, the fact that that's the same moment where in England all of the media went digital. So you went from newspapers that were out once a day or once a week, suddenly had websites that had to keep, you know, updating daily, and she kept giving them material. She was always out, she was always doing something, there was always another photo. She had that relationship that became very, very prominent. So that, you know, the News of the World and the Sun and the Mirror and the Daily Mail suddenly had something to latch onto. All of this happened at the same time. Her grandmother, who Nick's mentioned before, dying, who was the rock in the family and the strong one who could tell her off, dying just when the record comes out. You know, so no one's now telling her off or telling her to stop. all is mixed up and it's just so complicated. It's not one thing, it's 100 things. And that's just what we've got in the film. There's loads of other things as well. So I think the main bit of advice really is that a lot of people felt the best thing would be to pull her out of the limelight. Just stop it for a while. If you've got someone with such talent and an amazing artist, if someone to go away, you're still going to be here in a few years' time. Why not get well and then come back out and get the show on the road? Why keep churning it out and milking it and doing performances of an album that's 5 years old? You know, that's the other thing. She's performing in 2011, an album that she recorded in 2005.
Came out 2006, the album.
Yeah.
So, anybody else? Yes, lady here.
Right. As the movie was progressing, I started developing a very strong dislike for her father. And how did you decide how to treat the father and, you know, her relationship and all that sort of thing? That must have been a bit of a challenge.
Very complex situation, isn't it? I mean, it's much more complex because at the very beginning when this film came along, the people that I had to get kind of on to make the film were the label, her management, her estate, which her father is one of, the estate, you know. So those were the people I was saying, well, if you want me to make this film, let me have the music, let me have the publishing, then you have to leave me alone and let me make the film. And let me speak to everyone. And you can't edit, you can't tell me who I can and cannot speak to. And then we started making the film, and what we started to learn was that, okay, this is going to get tricky and complex. Because, you know, it's kind of almost this strange angel heart thing where I'm making a film and it's about the people that initially I met to make the film. So it was a delicate process. And you know, he's kind of quite prominent in the media in England. I don't know if people know about him much here, but he's like got books out and he's on TV a lot. And
Makes his own albums.
He's quite vocal, got quite a few friends around, and so it was a tricky one. But really, the clues in the title, I felt like I owed it to Amy. While we were making the film, none of the people who made the film started as huge Amy Winehouse fans. We all fell in love with her. We all felt like, you know what, we owe it to her to show who was around her and who was making bad calls. But to do it in a way where we are not, it's easy for filmmakers to pick on people, edit it in such a way to make them look bad. One of the things about making films using archive is I'm just showing you a little bit of what was going on, right? And it's not, that's one of the reasons about the kind of form of, it's not about me just giving an opinion or someone's talking head giving an opinion. I'm going to show you what was going on and the essence of what was going on. There's a lot more stuff that went on. So that, and you know, he's not a huge fan of me, he's not a huge fan of the film. But I heard it from so many people what was going on, and it became, we were the ones in that moment where we had the opportunity and we felt we had to do the right thing and try and show, because it's really easy for everyone to attack her and blame her and just call her a train wreck and she's a fool, she's an idiot, you had this talent, you wasted it, you know. And actually it's so much more complex than that, you know. She wanted someone to come up, pick her up, give her a hug and say, you don't need to do all that shit, you know, we care about you, we'll take you away from it, rather than keep her on stage.
Somebody, yes, madam in the front.
Well, I really thought that Amy had maybe hired you to make the movie while she was alive, and they were kind of doing it as the story went along because there was so much interaction with her. But the other thing is, now obviously this is a source of inspiration for her songs, but I would think most people who all were around her would not be able to stand this Blake and her obsessive love for him. And, well, now but obviously her artistry is reflected in her pain, you know, of what she was going through. And so it really made the songs, you know, just crystallize. And
much deeper songs, you realise how deep they are. Yeah, where they come from. It's a really interesting point, which is kind of what Nick says actually one point in the film of, you know, we could have, Nick, to paraphrase, says, you know, we could have helped her and made her better, and maybe that album would never have happened. And that's, I remember thinking this is an interesting thing about art generally, you know, a lot of art comes out of pain, and not just songs, but books, or, you know, sculpture, or whatever it may be. We're in a museum right now, so what's more important, to have the person or for people to have heard the record. And I think I found that quite a deep kind of question that comes out of the film. Yeah, maybe it would have been better obviously it's better for her to be around, but no one would know who she is, and that's a really complex situation there. You know, she put it all into her art.
I'm wondering if any of her friends or people ever did an intervention against him.
Yeah, I mean, there was no beating around the bush with saying what we felt. But at the same time, when someone's one of the most famous, successful artists in the world, they're in their 20s, they're married, they got married very quickly. It was very, you know, you suddenly hear your voice as you're trying to convince and as you're trying to get your opinion, and you're suddenly going, how can you tell someone who to be with, who not to be? You know, you can say what you think. And I think that there was a big element, my personal view is I think she was looking for a certain kind of character, a certain amount of drama. Maybe she was trying to test her parents, test various people around her. But I think she was drawn to him for his vulnerabilities and his issues. And they found something in each other. So it's, you know, I mean, I've had it in family, it's very common that someone you care about ends up with someone you're not sure about. It's a very complicated thing, very, very complicated thing, I think.
Yeah, good point. Anybody else? Yes, lady here. Lady, gentleman with a hat, the cap on, I'm sorry, gentleman, yeah.
Can you kind of fill us in on what happened to her husband and how his life was going?
Her husband, what happened to his wife, and how, so Blake, you know, he's kind of a troubled guy. That's why when I met him and I interviewed him, and you realise he had not a great start in life, I think, and kind of a troubled upbringing, and she had her issues, and so when they met, it was like they understood each other. And that's, I think, one of the things that drew her to him and him to her. Other things included, I'm sure, but actually there was something going on there. Once they broke up, he's still a troubled guy, to be honest. He went to prison for something. Again, I think he's tried to get clean, but I don't know, I'm not an expert. He lives away from London, which I think is one of the things that would have been good for Amy at some point, would have been to get the hell away from Camden and to get out of London and go somewhere far away and realise there's so much more going on in the world than just being stuck in a house. He's got kids, Blake has got kids, he's trying to have a family. He's struggling along, you know, they're only like in their low 30s now. They were kids when all of that stuff was going on. Amy was like 20s, low 20s, he's maybe a couple of years older. You know, they thought they ruled the world, but actually then, you know, they were children who needed, you know, grown-ups around them to kind of come in and pull them out of it. And unfortunately the grown-ups were not set up right maybe to pull them out of it.
Yeah, I think we could talk all night, but is that all the time we have now? One more question? Yes? One more question. Who do we have? Anybody? Yeah.
This is a lighthearted question, but any insight on where her hairstyle is?
Yeah, Ronnie Spector, I guess. I mean, she loved, you know, she loved American 60s girl groups. She loved the look. What was always great for me, seeing Amy's creativity with her music and her style, is she managed to do something that a lot of people try to do and fail, which is take the inspiration from the past and then just put a little twist on it and make it hers, and as opposed to just being a pastiche. And I think that was it in her music. When you listen to her album, it sounds classic, but it also sounds new. Her phrasing, her lyrics, the heaviness of the beat. It's like a hip-hop record, but it was recorded like an old girl group record. And I think that was it with her style. You know, she'd see someone she really idolised, but then she'd be wearing, you know, big hooped earrings and, you know, Nike trainers with like old classic vintage 60s Americana, you know, girl glorious.
What's interesting is having seen quite a few of her diaries from a young age, how, you know, you might think, oh, someone came in, there was a stylist or something like that. It's all her.
All her.
She was drawing all these pictures with these girls with this eye makeup and the hair, like much earlier than she actually started wearing it. It was something she was obviously going through. She was quite into comic books. She used to kind of read comic books and illustrations and like, what's the...
Yeah, the other
American
one,
wrestling.
Wrestling and also Superwoman. You know, like there was.
She thought of herself like one of these characters. Or
Yeah, she was really, it all came from her.
I also think there's a little moment in the film. It was quite hard finding footage of her grandmother. And when you see her grandmother young, I think that look for me is that's her grandmother's look, who was hanging out with Ronnie Scott, who I don't know if he's like a big jazz club musician, right? And that kind of link to her grandmother, I think, is there as well. So that hair and the eyes, all of that comes from kind of other artists in the 60s, but also, for me, my reading is it's her grandmother's.
Yes.
Fine.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question, sorry?
A big hand for Nick.